Hey folks, we're about to get started. So if everyone could shuffle into the middle rows, that would be excellent. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Liam is a former developer turned pen tester. His passion is not just breaking systems, but providing empathetic and actionable advice on how they can be improved. Liam is also a duck enthusiast. They seem to be everywhere. Liam is going to give a talk about what ancient world physical fortifications can teach us in the modern security systems.
Thank you. Thank you. As Eliza said, my name's Liam. I'm a pen tester. So normally I usually find myself at hacker conferences and I talk a lot about breaking stuff. So I'm actually super excited to switch it up by coming to a developer conference and actually talking about building and making stuff. As Eliza said, I'm into ducks. I like my ducks upright. I'm also have a side interest that I realized recently has been around since I've been a little kid in castles. That was me a very long time ago. Here's me also a long time ago. Here's me a little bit more recently. I'd like to give a talk just about castles, but unfortunately the PyCon organisers would prefer me to talk at least a little bit about technology at some stage. So if we're talking about IT systems and building them, and specifically building them securely, okay, how do we do that? So big, broad question. So of course, your first go-to is there an ISO standard for this? And of course there is this ISO 27000 series, 27001 specifically. You know, so this is my very, very high-level summary of ISO. You won't actually find these three things in the documents because they're huge, but this is a sort of Liam's version of that. So what are these three things? Threat modeling is what are we protecting? Who are we protecting it from? And how might those adversaries try and attack our stuff? And that feeds into risk assessments, which we do some assessments, we analyze the different threats and we say, okay, how realistic is this? If it happened, how bad would it be? How much do I have to worry about that? Which allows us to rank all these issues. And then it's all a bit of a paper-based exercise, but it feeds into, hopefully, eventually, our actual architecture, the security controls that we implement in our systems to provide the actual protection. So there's a couple of problems with this. Firstly is it's pretty dry. I mean, I'm into security. I love this stuff, and even I find some of this stuff quite dry. The other problem is that this sort of process, as described, is pretty old school. For those of you who have one or two grey hairs like me, you may remember this as the way that software used to be built. This was how it was mainly taught at uni when I started. So the waterfall model where we do one big step and then we do another big step and then we do another big step and they feed into each other. And that's pretty much the way that security is also described. But of course, in the modern world, we've moved on from the waterfall model, and most software, not all, is done with some sort of agile methodology where we sort of take an iterative approach to developing software. We can totally do this with security as well. We can have the output of one feeding into another. Today, I am not going to talk about threat modeling or risk assessment because, as I said, they're pretty dry, they're not very exciting, and they're not really related to castles. But security controls that's where the rubber meets the road. These are the actual things that you're building, unlike threat modeling and risk assessment, which are just a paper-based thing. I say paper-based, obviously that's a metaphor because nothing's actually done on paper these days, it's all on computers. On the topic of metaphors, clearly the castle thing is a metaphor as well. I just want to be really clear and say, I am not saying you should build your software like castles. A lot of metaphors, particularly in security, have been quite harmful. This like cyber weapons, Like, if you take this too seriously, you'll find yourself like writing a think piece on Medium about when will be the next, or the first cyber Pearl Harbor. What I'm actually saying is, what can we learn about the way that castles and fortifications are developed, and how can we apply some of that learning to the way in which we build software? So it's a metaphor. That's it. Let's crack on. Okay, so let's forget that computers exist. So we've traveled back in time about 2,000 years. And we're living in, say, the British Isles, in these nice little round houses with our extended family, our cattle, bit of farming. That's great. It's not all great, though, because there are other clans that live nearby. And sort of the rules of the day were, if you can take something off someone, that's totally cool. And so you've got these folk who are sort of interested in taking your land and your cattle and probably enslaving your family if they can get away with it. So everyone's worried about this, but fortunately you've been grinding XP and you've developed enough skill to go up a level, and instead of like putting it into the next level of farmer, you've discovered this new skill tree that no one else has sort of noticed before, and you've unlocked a new class called an engineer. So you go, cool, what can an engineer do? And you say, well, let's see. And you look at your village and you say, look, these roundhouses are nice, but what if we built a wall around them? And people say, engineers, you're a genius, that's great. And walls are great because they're easy to build. We've already got axes, we've already got wood. And it was definitely better than when we didn't have a wall, because we can use it to defend our village. So great. It's a simple control that we can use to protect our village. And that's great, problem solved. Except the nearby villages have also been grinding XP. And instead of speaking into engineering or farming, some of them have decided they're going to be dedicated attackers. So they take a look at your wall and they go, wall? Better than when you didn't have a wall. But there's probably some things that we can do to defeat this control. We can burn it down, smash it, or you can just climb over it. It's not that tall. So it's a simple control, but it's not particularly strong. So you put your engineer hat back on. You say, all right, we're going to make it out of stone, and we're going to make it higher. Can't burn it down. Can't smash it with axes. It's difficult to climb over. So all of a sudden, you've gone from simple but weak, but you've got a simple and strong control. So clearly, this is a better control. This problem's still not solved because your adversaries continue to get better. And they get a little bit more determined. They say, I reckon with enough effort, we can probably still defeat your stone wall. So you go, okay, what else can I do? Look, the wall was good. How about more walls? Because we already know how to make the walls. So let's just do it again. And you think you're very smart. And in some ways, this is a good way of layering some controls. The great thing about particularly doing walls concentrically, so circles within circles, is they're going to fail independently. That means if the outside wall is breached, they get a hole in it or they climb over it, they still have to defeat the inner walls. So to illustrate that, an example of something that doesn't fail independently is if I have a wall with a gate in it, the adversary will either have to defeat the gate or defeat the wall. They don't have to defeat both of them. Okay, so you've got your some independent controls, but your adversaries are still getting better. And they do a bit of thinking about the wall and they go, what if we do to defeat the first wall? We just do it again to defeat the next wall? Like, oh yeah. So that's another thing that we want from multiple controls is it's great if they're diverse. There's probably something you can take out of that in terms of building teams, but I'm specifically talking about security controls today. And so your adversaries start analysing these walls that you've built. You go, okay, So you've got your wall, and it's just a wall, so you're going to have defenders on it as well. So they're going to be sitting there. You're going to have the stuff that they want on the inside. The defenders have got bows and arrows. They're going to have this zone of control that they're using to protect these walls. So that's what it looks like. But the problem with this is, you can see that there's these weak points where they're not necessarily overlapping as much as they could be. So an intelligent attacker will be able to point out their weak points and focus their attacks on them. And if they manage to take out one of the defenders, all of a sudden a little weak point can become a big weak point. Okay, so attacks are getting better, defenders are getting better. Let's jump in our time machine again and leave the Iron Age behind and jump forward to the Middle Ages. And so you've gone up several levels in engineering, and this is the sort of thing that you're rocking. Pretty good looking castle. This is more like when people say castle, this is what most people have in their mind. So, but how good is it? Why is it built this way? So if we put our bad guy or adversary hat on and sort of have a look at this, we go, okay, all right, so where could we attack this? We could try and smash the gate in. The gate looks like a pretty good spot, just there. But the way it's been designed is that these towers, we can have our defenders sitting on the walls, raining arrows on you while you're trying to smash down the gate. Okay, I'm not really keen on that as an attacker. What about the wall? Pretty much the same thing with the wall. We've got these two towers that overlook the wall. Okay, is there any points in this where they can't sort of have multiple people raining down arrows on me? Because I'm not keen on that at all. It's like, yeah, what about here on the edge? It's like, yeah, there's really only one place where defenders can attack you there. But as a defender, you force them to attack the strongest part of your castle. Like, this is where your walls are the tallest, and this is where they're the thickest. So there's a bunch of nice design features there. The most important thing is that we're no longer thinking about walls as something that protect what's inside the walls. The walls also protect themselves. So they're self-defending. So it can be another control attribute that we can think about. These walls are simple, they're strong, but they also defend themselves. But of course, adversaries continue to get better. But so do we. So we upgrade our castle again, and now we've got what UNESCO describes as one of the best concentric middle-aged castles. This is Beaumaris Castle in Wales. It's not actually finished. The walls were meant to go higher, but then Edward I ran out of money because he sort of conquered the Welsh at that stage because it was in Wales, and then he was on to fighting the Scots, and he's like, nah, stop spending money on Wales. They're done. Okay, so let's do a quick analysis of this. Like, obviously, these are some nice strong walls. And we've got a couple of different layers there. So we got, there's the inner series of walls. We got the outer walls, and they're clearly independent. You'd have to get in defeat those walls one at a time. But there's something else here that we haven't seen before, which is a moat. And that's cool because that's an extra layer of controls. But remember when we just had like 3 walls and we were saying, you can just defeat them the same way because they're not diverse. The moat is cool because anything that you use to defeat a moat, you probably can't really use to defeat a wall. So like if I build a boat, that'll definitely help me get over a moat, but it's not going to help me get over the wall. And a ladder probably won't help me get over a moat as well. And another thing is, these controls, as well as defending themselves, they can defend each other. So if you've built some boats that you're going to use to get over the moat, that's cool. And while you're doing that, the defenders on the walls can be smashing you with arrows. So not only are they self-defending, but they can actually defend each other as well. And same thing with these walls, like the outer walls are shorter than the inner walls. So if you're like attacking the outer wall, the people from the inner wall can be like, oh yeah, let's get some arrows downrange on them as well. So we can say that these controls are mutually supporting controls. So like any time that someone's trying to attack one of the controls, the other controls are in action. They're not just sitting there passively. Okay, so we've got a couple of the attributes for individual controls looking good. The way they interact with each other also looking good. Probably the only disadvantage of this, as Edward I found out, is that by the time you've got a really complex castle like this, you can no longer really say that it's simple. It's hard to have everything. So this is a little bit of a summary of what we've talked about so far in terms of the way that you can evaluate these security controls and in particular how multiple controls interact with each other. There's also some other important principles that we can apply when we level up a bit more in engineering. So like people talk about reducing attack surface. This is a great example of that. This is Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy in France. This is actually it at high tide. At low tide, there is land around it. So, you know, you can't even really rock up on boats and lay siege to this castle because at low tide, your boats get grounded and you can't stand there because at high tide, you drown. So this is a great place for a castle. There's some other things you can do. So segmentation is something that, you know, security people always harp on about. You know, you want to be able to segment your environment. So this is not a good example of that because, say for example, once you're inside those outer walls, you can pretty much run around anywhere in that like sort of inner or intermediate sort of grassed area. So an example of a fortification that sort of has the principle of least privilege is this awesome beast, which was designed. So this is sort of like when the age of cannon had started coming up. So like really high stone walls were no longer in vogue. But this is great because, you know, like you get over one moat and then you're just on this like little bit of land and you're just like, well, I can't even get to the other bits of land. Like this would be really, really hard to plan an attack. And it also looks great. So as you're leveling up further and further in engineering, there's some things that are worth considering in that you might be like shooting for this, like, oh yeah, I've got this like epic skill in mind and I'm going to shoot for this. I'm going to put all my points into this tree. Some things you can never do. You will never be infallible. You'll never know everything about the environment. You'll never know everything about your attackers. And you're going to make mistakes. So you won't be infallible. You won't be omniscient. And also, no controls that you come up with are indefeatable. But there is one epic tier thing that you can unlock, and that is over-engineering. All right? Over-engineering is great. So if you're building a castle, you're like, okay, well, you know, my threat model is the Duke of the other side of the harbour. You know, I reckon he can muster about, 10,000 troops. So you're going to design a wall that can withstand, 20,000 troops. And then all of a sudden, you're surprised because, they've made an alliance through marriage with some other, the Earl of Bondi. And all of a sudden they muster 18,000 troops and you're like, I'm still fine because I engineered the crap out of this. This is great. All right. So, castles are fun to talk about, but unfortunately, we need to probably also talk a little bit about technology. All right, so this sort of way of assessing your controls applies to any sort of security control, whether you're building castles, whether you're building, physical access control, so like, doors, or whether you're building IT systems, like it's all the same. So let's go for a really common scenario. Okay, we're building a website, as everyone is these days, but we don't want everyone to be able to read the data on it. So how are we going to stop everyone from accessing the data. So we go, okay, putting passwords on it seemed like a good idea, so let's do that. Our control to protect our sensitive data is you need a password to be entered first before you can get to the sensitive area of the website. All right, cool. So we're doing that with our favorite web application framework, which is, of course, Django, because it's PyCon. And we go, all right, how do we do that? Okay, there's some middleware that we can enable. And we'll add a nice little login screen that's definitely not from a Babby's first Django tutorial. Okay, so let's have a think about this control. How good is it? This is definitely simple. Like there's nothing really complicated or hard in terms of implementing this. Is it strong? To determine whether a control is strong, you really have to think about what am I talking about it being strong against? So, how could it be attacked? All right. So there's a couple of different sort of attacks that we can think of off the top of our head on passwords. Like people could guess them, could find them where they're stored, whether it's written down or on your Dropbox or somewhere checked into GitHub. Not that anyone would ever check creds into GitHub, or they could be intercepted on the wire. All right. So as it is on the face of it, probably passwords as is couldn't be described as a particularly strong control. But we can harden the control. All right, so if we're now going to say we've got passwords, but we're going to have a complexity policy, so they're difficult to guess. You have to have minimum 8 characters, some special characters thrown in. Your basic password complexity policy. We're always going to use SSL or TLS for data in transit, so it's going to make it hard for adversaries to read it off the wire. And at least when we store the passwords, we're going to use strong hashes. Pretty hard to stop users from storing their password. So it's now a stronger control. Are passwords self-defending? What would that look like? Well, on a standard password form, with no other sort of controls, like an attacker could try a password, it doesn't work. Or try another one, doesn't work. Try another one, doesn't work. Script that up, try 100,000 passwords, eventually they get one right. It's not really self-defending as is, but there's some really simple ways that we can make it self-defending. Like we could rate limit it. So you can only try one login every 5 seconds. Or if you fail a login, the next time you want to log in, you need to solve a CAPTCHA. So there's some simple tweaks that we can do to make this control self-defending. All right, so pretty happy with this as an individual control. But is the job done? Unfortunately not, because adversaries always get better. And the problem with this is that if it's a all or nothing control, if your password is compromised, that's it, it's game over. So maybe we need a little bit of defense in depth, we need some layered controls, we're going to need another control. All right, so the password one was pretty good. Let's add another control. So to log in, you need a password, and then you also need to answer a secret question. So what was your dog's maiden name? What street did your cat grow up on? That sort of thing. So let's think about this control. Is it simple? Yeah, it's simple. It's obviously very similar to a password. It's strong? Not really. There's only so many answers to these things. It's clearly not as strong as passwords. Is it self-defending? It's like, well, yeah, if we apply the same sort of CAPTCHA stuff, let's be generous and say yes. All right, so in summary, yeah, this second control is actually not looking terrible. But let's think about how the two interact with each other. Do they fail independently? Well, what were those things that we talked about, how the password would fail? Well, if one control failed, so if the password control failed, what would then happen to the secret question control? All right, if someone guesses your password, they're probably not, it doesn't necessarily mean that the secret question fails. If they find it stored, yeah, you probably stored them side by side, so yeah, it's going to fail. If you intercept it on the wire, yeah, the other thing's going to be on the wire right next to it. So they don't really fail independently. Are they diverse? No. I mean, they're very, very similar controls. You know, it's like add a secret string that only you know to an answer. So I don't think we could really describe them as diverse controls. Are they mutually supporting? Not really. There could be some ways that you could engineer it to make it seem mutually supporting, but not really. So the defense in depth that's really offered by that second control is not ideal. But you know, was it a bad idea entirely? Have we made our solution better, or have we just not improved it at all? I would argue that yeah, like we've increased the security of the solution by adding a second control. Like there's nothing weaker. It's marginally better, but you probably wasted a fair bit of engineering time implementing this that you could have spent doing some analysis instead and realizing that this wasn't a great idea. So let's switch it up. So let's replace control 2 and get rid of the secret question things. Like that doesn't seem like a great idea. Instead, let's use a one-time password, which is like using Google Authenticator, a whole bunch of things that generate a simple one-time code that you also add in at the same time as password. Is it simple? Yep. Is it strong? Yep. It's obviously a lot stronger. I'm not going to go through analyzing all this. Is it self-defending? Yep, in the same way that a password can be. So all of a sudden, we've got these two controls that they're looking pretty good, but let's analyze how they work together. So again, looking at how they fail. If I manage to guess your password, would I necessarily get access to your OTP? No, because it's just a little random string. If I access it stored, if I access your password while it was stored, would I get access to your OTP? It's like, no, the OTPs aren't stored. They're a one-time thing that's generated on the fly. If I intercepted it on the wire, would I get access to your OTP? It's like, well, actually, yeah, you would. That's where OTP's weakness is. But it's pretty good. In most attack scenarios, they fail independently. So let's give it a tick for fail independently. Being generous. Are they diverse? Yeah, they're totally different controls. Do they mutually support each other? Sort of depends on how you implement it. Old school ways, like this, where you need both your PIN and your password, and then it doesn't tell you PIN and the OTP, and then it doesn't tell you which one you got wrong. That's sort of mutually supporting. But the pattern these days is let's go with enter your password, then enter your OTP, and you only get 1 or 2 attempts to get the OTP right, and then it'll kick you back. So looking at those two controls, they seem to work pretty well. They support each other quite well. These are some better layered controls. Don't just take my word for it. NIST, who is sort of the standards body for a whole bunch of things, say stop using knowledge-based authentication. There's some other things we could do to harden this solution. Could we reduce the attack surface? It's like, yeah, if I know that my users are only ever going to log in from my home IP range, I can just whitelist that IP range and no one else can access it. There's probably a bunch of other things you can do to harden the solution. But the main thing I wanted to talk about was how we can assess these security controls both in isolation and how we can assess how they interact with each other. So the question that doesn't answer is how much is enough? How many controls do I need? Like I've got these 2 good controls that I've decided work pretty well together. Do I need a 3rd one? Do I need to keep hardening the environment? Like how much engineering time should I dedicate to this? And this is where it feeds back into this little threat modeling thing. So how much work you need to do depends on the threats that you're facing and the risks. So after we've implemented these security controls, we can go back, do some more threat modeling, do some more risk assessment. If we need to adjust or improve our security controls, we can do so. So that's the very high-level view of how to do ISO 27001. You're definitely not certified, so don't put this on your LinkedIn or anything. That's everything I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.